Hello, and welcome back to Sex, Love, and the Self. Just a quick reminder before we begin that if you'd like to explore and deepen your own personal power through self-love, I offer a wide variety of resources on my website. There's tarot card readings, downloadable meditations, books, workshops, even one-on-one coaching sessions to help you identify where you can seize your power and love yourself and your life more. Okay, so I guess there's another quick thing before we begin. I owe you all an apology for the lapse in the podcast. I was in the middle of a full-on website revamp, packing to move to the other side of Colombia, and I just overscheduled myself. Thank you for your compassion. Okay, now, finally, let's get started. So, last time, I think it was like 2 weeks ago now, I talked about the idea that people aren't here to play a role in our lives. Our parents, our siblings, our boyfriends, our boss, they are here with their own agenda, their own soul goals, let's say. So when we have conflict, we can take a step back and look at what expectations we have of them based on the role that they play. And then we can realize how releasing those expectations can change the conflict. If they weren't our partners, parent, sibling, whatever, would we expect different things from them? And if we can accept them the way that they are, can we be satisfied with the way that they fill that role? So the thing I want to talk about today is how that same idea can be extended to ourselves. I think sometimes we feel somewhat trapped in our lives, like victimized by our circumstances. We tell ourselves that there are all these things that we want to do but can't do, or we feel like we're stuck in a role that we don't want to be playing in someone else's life, or a role that we don't want to be playing in our lives. And I think often that comes from expectations that we put on ourselves. And look, I mean, there's a huge variety of expectations, obviously, and sometimes we're very aware of the expectations we're putting on ourselves, like the number of times that we want to try to go to the gym every week, for instance, or the books that we want to read, or the work that we want to get done in a certain time frame or whatever. And the problem with even those more benign expectations, let's say, is that when we don't hit those marks, of course, we feel like a failure. Pointing at myself here, I felt like such a failure between the last published podcast and this one. And part of that comes from the fact that for me, my personality type, it is so easy for me to feel a little bit like a failure and then just drop everything, which only makes me feel like more of a failure. But I get discouraged and I feel like, oh, I missed that mark. I'm just going to surrender it all. It's just the week is lost. It's not going to happen. And then I wallow in that self-criticism in some way. But the truth is that failure comes when we totally abandon something, correct? I mean, in part, that's what I'm telling myself right now. But I think that it does hold true, at least in part, because if we can forgive ourselves, we can continue to move past it. We can pick that project back up. We can come back to that thing and continue to work on it. Just because we didn't do it when we thought we would or how we thought we would doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. Although I do want to make a little sidebar here, because sometimes that's true. Sometimes we do need to be able to fully abandon something, have the failure thing. When I was first becoming a writer, I had this dream of being a very successful author. And I've published a couple of books, as you know, and they sell well. But I would see a post from someone, for instance, a 18-year-old girl that wrote her first memoir and it was a Pulitzer Prize winner and whatever right off the bat. And I would feel pangs of envy, perhaps, about that. Because I felt like I had failed. My books weren't that successful. They didn't rise to that level. However, now, decades later, in the case of the first book, I've realized that the authorship was not the thing that I really wanted and needed. I love to write, I do. But I love even more working in the spiritual realm. I love even more the coaching that I get to do, the tarot card readings that I offer, all of these other things that support people in living different kinds of lives. Like As it turns out, I didn't want to just be a storyteller. I don't want to be a storyteller. And I don't mean just as in to diminish the value of that. Of course, there's a ton of value in that. Those are beautiful, talented, successful people. Congratulations to them. The point is, that dream that I held, that I had felt like I was a failure at, was actually not meant for me. That's not where I'm meant to be, nor where I'm meant to put my effort. If I had become, quote, successful in the way that I had thought at that time, I perhaps would not be doing the thing that I'm doing now, which feeds me so much more deeply. Okay, so anyway, back to the idea that if we continue to put effort in, if we forgive ourselves and go back and pick up the project or the goal or the version of ourselves that we want to be, we aren't failing. We're just human. And, another fallout of holding these high expectations of ourselves is that it can easily translate into high expectations of other people. We begin to believe that the thing that we're doing or striving for is, quote, the right thing, and that other people should be doing that too. For instance, let's say you consider yourself a vegan and you've put that label on yourself. In order to meet that goal, in order to be defined in that way, you're probably holding then this high expectation of the way that you eat and what you buy. And to hold that high expectation, often we justify that to ourselves. We reinforce that belief to ourselves by saying, this is the right way to be. And that's why I have to hold myself to this high expectation. This is the way it, quote, should be, the way I, quote, should be. And so easily that slips over into the way other people should be, because we run around gathering up the evidence for the reasons that we believe this about ourselves. And of course, that evidence is going to sort of leak out in the expectations that we hold of others. Not only that, it implies this level of perfectionism, like you have to be perfectly vegan. If you eat a bite of cheese on a taco or something, then you've ruined your veganism, which leaves no space for your imperfectness. And that's what makes you human. That's part of what makes you special. Not only that, it leaves no room for the imperfection in others. And so it's really difficult it can be really difficult for us to fully love without judgment the people around us that are not living up to this unacknowledged expectation that we're holding. However, perhaps the worst version, and what I really wanted to dig into today a little bit, is this idea that we feel trapped or kind of caged by these unacknowledged expectations that we're putting on ourselves. For instance, you may feel in part defined by your role in your community, in your job. And by putting that label on yourself, all of these expectations come along with it. The way that you show up for your community, how much time and effort you put in, how much sacrifice you make in other parts of your life in order to fulfill those obligations. There's all of this stuff that's sort of dictated, and that honestly can come from the outside world, or it can be dictated to us by the outside world, those expectations. And the same thing comes in the roles that we play in other people's lives, like I mentioned before. This idea that to be the perfect partner, you need to be anticipating your partner's needs, for instance, or you need to be self-sacrificing to the point where their needs come before yours. Or if you put labels on yourself, even in descriptive terms like being an introvert, for instance, or being adventurous, we humans tend to use those labels then both to criticize, to self-criticize, and to guide our decisions. And that latter point is not bad in and of itself. We can identify the kind of people that we want to be and use that as the guide force in the decisions that we make in our lives to push us ever closer to the versions of ourselves that we do want to be. That's a beautiful thing. However, if you've defined yourself as adventurous, for instance, and you say no to the trip to climb Mount Everest or something, there may be a sense of failure in that. That may come along with some self-criticism because an adventurous person would do this thing. And I am an adventurous person, but I don't want to do this thing. And I've talked about this before and the way that we can kind of remove those labels. But the version that is so front and center for me today is this idea of being free in our lives in those expectations. And the whole topic came up for me because I was speaking with a friend of mine who has spent several years in Mexico. And we talked about how much freer we both felt living outside of our home country. And we kind of explored the idea, like, is this a problem like with the United States? Is there some kind of unexpressed or unacknowledged expectation that's put on us because we're Americans or something like that? And I think that there's, truth in that in part, but I don't think that that's the root of the situation. This is a problem with our perception of the expectations that come under that definition, particularly in front of people that we know, friends, family, even just acquaintances. Look, I think travel in part is so particularly empowering because you face your discomfort. You get to know yourself outside of prescribed norms. You are forced to adapt to environments that are wildly foreign to you. And you get to see yourself, almost observe yourself in those contexts. And it strips away all of this who you should be, the kind of decisions you should make, the twists and turns that are expected to be taken in your life. It helps you to learn what it means to truly be free, to stop giving any shits what anybody else thinks, because you're never going to fit in that new country. You're never going to live up to whatever implied expectations are there because of their culture, because of their language, because of the civilization, their history, whatever it is, because you're not from there. So you're immediately given this sort of license to step outside of what they would consider normal, acceptable. You're expected to be different. You're expected to be, quote, weird or whatever, outside of their normal. And so when you spend a significant amount of time outside of that normal, outside of their normal, and then also obviously outside of your own home environment, there's this sort of stripping away of all of these ideas that you need to be this kind of person, make these kinds of decisions, eat this kind of food, do these kinds of things. And then when you get back home, there's this realization that you're different. You've changed because of the experiences. Of course, our experiences change us all the time. Often we're not very aware of them, or they're more minor changes. Like, you go on vacation and you set yourself free to eat whatever you want or get real drunk or whatever you do. And those are liberating moments as well. I'm not suggesting that everybody goes to get drunk by any stretch of the imagination. My point is just that we give ourselves those windows of freedom and liberty in small doses, in things like our vacations, for instance, or stepping outside of our home environment in smaller ways. But the dramatic shifts that happen, the deep kind of fundamental ones, where we feel fully stripped bare of all of the sort of external labels that define us, I think that's when we start to feel who we really are. I remember talking to a friend of mine once about the idea of being in this new country, and at the time I didn't speak Spanish very well, and it was frustrating for a million reasons, but one of the big ones was I didn't have a personality in front of these people because I didn't have the language. I couldn't make jokes. They didn't understand my sense of humor. They didn't understand the things that lit me up. They didn't understand my personal belief system or even my political stance because I couldn't communicate those things. But it ended up being a beautifully purifying process because I had to rely entirely on my energy to show who I was. I had to rely entirely on the surface level interactions that I was having to send a message or to offer the opportunity for these people to connect with me in some way based on who I was, without the ability to kind of armor myself with my language, with my, the label that I would like to put on myself. Had I been in an English-speaking country, for instance, I would have liked to have said, I'm a writer and I own a couple of magazines and I've published a couple of books or something along those lines. But I couldn't say any of that, not in a way that meant anything. I couldn't elaborate on it. I couldn't get deep. So the question comes then, how? How do we give ourselves that kind of freedom, that stripping away of all of these outside definitions? How do we give ourselves the kind of freedom that comes with being almost exclusively an energy being in a reality? If we can't go, live for 6 months in another country that doesn't speak the same language. And the thing is, From a reflexive belief system standpoint, I want to believe that it's just a choice. You just decide that you don't have to fit in anywhere. But we're humans, and humans as a species work better in groups. We just do. We need each other. We need community. We need connection. And it's such a strange thing to feel uncomfortable in your own skin at home. And I think that in part that's a response from the trauma of being rejected early on in life. It begins so early. We're so conditioned to fit in, to find our tribe, to connect to people that believe in the same things. Even as little children in our friend groups, we are encouraged to find a way to fit in. And I think that's important. Of course, we need to be able to understand how to interact with each other in ways that are respectful, supportive, kind, all of those things. Absolutely, we have to have that. But I think there's also room for us to support the other side of that, which is that we're also conditioned to be special. We humans want to be special. Yes, we want to fit in and be accepted, but we also want to feel like unique individuals. We don't want to feel like a cog in the wheel, like just another soldier in the line. And so I think there are some ways, some things, literal like actions we can take, things that we can do to give ourselves that kind of freedom, to step wildly outside of our comfort zones, even at home, and give ourselves the opportunity to explore who we really are, how we can give ourselves this level of freedom in our daily lives by just changing up our environment and changing up the way that we make our decisions to strip away those labels. But I'm going to get into all of that over on Patreon. If you want to connect with me on Patreon and get into these ideas with me, check me out at patreon.com/author Jacqueline Lene. Or check out the website. There's the link to the Patreon community there as well. Also, like I said, I just revamped the whole thing in order to make it a little bit easier for you to get to exactly the tools that you may want or need. And I've got books and custom meditations and tarot card readings and personal coaching sessions, and there's just loads of good stuff available over there. That's at jacquelinelanee.blog, JACLYNLANAE.blog. Okay, I hope you all have a wonderful, empowered week. Thank you so much for listening. Ciao for now.